The historian Josephus wrote about 2,000 years ago about an inscription that was posted on the entrances to the temple courts in Greek, warning against anyone who was a non-Jew from going through that entrance. And until archaeologists discovered two copies, and those are the pictures of the two copies, they actually found two of these wall plaques, I guess you would call them, that confirmed that Josephus was right. The words were basically what he had said they were. Look at what it says on the plaque. No stranger is to enter within the balustrade round the temple and enclosure. Whoever is caught will be himself responsible for his ensuing death. By stranger, they mean Gentile there. The Romans allowed this. If you went into the temple courts and you were not a descendant of Abraham, they would execute you. Let's keep that in mind as we take a look at our text this morning in the Gospel of Mark as Jesus confronts this attitude, because these warnings illustrate a possessiveness about the temple, the idea that it is our place, our sanctuary, our temple, and less of a focus on the fact that it is God's temple. Keep in mind that when the Apostle Paul was tried, when his court case, the court case that led him to Rome, was about the accusation that he brought a Gentile into the temple courts, which of course he did not, but that was the thing that led the mob to try to kill him on the spot. That's how seriously they took this. Let's take a look at the text. Mark chapter 11, verse 15. Some of you are paying astute attention and you're saying, what about 12, 13, and 14? We didn't do those last week. That'll be next week. There's a reason for it. 12 through 14 goes with 19 and the following. They're bookends on this middle part. But I think it will benefit us to look at the middle first and then what bookends it. So we will be getting back to verse 12 next week, never fear. I wouldn't just skip verses. Verse 15 says, on reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple courts. This is Monday of Passover week, and Jesus is once more leaving Bethany and spending the day in Jerusalem. And of course, he goes to the temple courts. That's the natural destination for Jesus, because at this time, pilgrims are flooding into Jerusalem. Passover starts on Thursday. People are coming from all over the Roman world and beyond for the Passover, making their pilgrimage, not to mention the people from the Judean area as well, people that are only a day's walk away. The place is going to be flooded with people. Over the years, Jesus will have visited this temple many, many times. Even on one of his first trips as a teen, he was at Jerusalem for his dedication. We don't know about in the years between, but when he came as a young man to be declared as a son of the covenant, a son of the law, on that occasion, Jesus was teaching in the temple courts, teaching, of course, his elders. And many times since then, Jesus has taught people in the temple courts, especially at the festivals. And this last time is no exception. But before he teaches the people, and we'll be looking at those texts in the weeks ahead, before he teaches people in the temple, Jesus decides to put his zeal for the house of the Lord into action. He decides to correct a long-standing injustice that is afflicting some of the people coming to worship at the house of the Lord, and it is an offense to God. What is that thing? Well, here's his action. He began driving out those who were buying and selling there. When pilgrims came to Jerusalem, those living far away didn't bring their sacrificial animals with them. That makes sense, right? If you're coming from Alexandria, from Rome, from Ephesus, you're not going to bring with you lambs and other things that you need for the journey. Nor do they have with them when they arrive the local shekel that you need to pay the temple tax. Everybody had to pay a temple tax. You had to pay it in the local currency. The reason for that makes perfect sense. Remember when they asked Jesus about taxes, Jesus says, "Show me the coin. Whose face is on it?" Caesar's face was on the coin. That coin was declaring that Caesar is a god. Most of the coins in the ancient Near East had a god or a monarch who pretended to be a god on the coin. You can't put a coin like that in the temple treasury because it's a graven image, because it is a idolatry. So you had to exchange your money when you came to Israel in order to put in the tax. On top of that, with the animals, the local animals, the ones here for sale, would have already been certified by the Levites as being kosher. In other words, they've been inspected. They're not blemished. They can be used for a sacrifice. If you bring an animal from outside in, then it has to be inspected. That's another hoop to go through. So everything being done here in the temple courts, the purchase of animals, the exchange of currency, was absolutely necessary for the pilgrims to fulfill the law. They had to do this. And this was the place they were doing it in, but they had to do it. So why is Jesus directly challenging the authority of the high priest, right? The high priest is the one who ultimately authorizes these activities in this place, and Jesus is going right at him. It's not so much what is being done that makes Jesus act, but where it is being done. We're going to look at that this morning, because this is the court of the Gentiles, and this is the only place that Gentile converts to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob can worship God. Remember that we started by talking about these inscriptions. All right, if you look on the map, this is the outer area beyond those steps. And each of those gates has a sign on it that says, if you're not a Jew and you come in here, you're a dead man. So outside of that wall is the only place a Gentile can worship God. And that's where the marketplace is. Now, I love a good church bake sale. That may be a plug for doing one in the future. Apple pies, oh, they're amazing. Cookies, they're awesome. We're raising money for missions, for the college scholarship fund, for the food pantry, I don't care what. If we're doing a bake sale, I'm in, right? It's a good cause and a useful purpose. But imagine if instead of doing that in the entranceway or over in Clark Hall, if the ceiling hadn't recently fallen in and need to be repaired, maybe over in Latchaw, doing it over there. Imagine if instead of doing it over there, we sat up the table right back there in the sanctuary. That would feel weird. But there's more to this puzzle, because it's not just the where, but also the when, because they would be selling it during the church service. So while we're singing, while Dick is leading prayer, while I'm leading prayer, while I'm trying to preach, somebody is in the back selling stuff and having conversations about selling stuff. Now, we could probably get over the distraction for a bake sale. A little bit different when it's cows and sheep and doves and all the money exchanging, all the clinking of the coins. It's hard enough for us sometimes when one of those semis zooms by, shakes the building a little bit during the church service. Can you imagine trying to come to Jerusalem as a Gentile, as an outsider anyway, and finding that the one place you're allowed to worship, they set up a market in. How are you supposed to do that? He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in the Synoptic Gospels, this episode is during Holy Week, during Passion Week, at the end of Jesus' life. The Gospel of John has a very similar episode in the beginning. There's one of two explanations for that. Either Jesus did this twice. 2-3 years ago, he came here, saw that it was like this, and did what he did. And now he comes back and says, okay, we're going to do this again, are we? Or John said, you know what? I like that episode at the beginning of the ministry because it sets the tone. And in the ancient world, moving things thematically was no big deal for a historian. So one of those two things is the explanation. It doesn't matter to me because he definitely did it at least once. Everyone records it. But imagine the scene, the chaos, right? We've got people and animals going everywhere, Jesus flipping tables. But think about that for a minute. This is just one guy. There's no mention here that his disciples were helping him do it, but even if they were, there's hundreds, if not thousands of people in this courtyard. He's massively outnumbered. Why doesn't it say that someone stopped him? No temple guards, no merchants saying, dude, what are you doing to my stuff? Everyone is running. Why? Text doesn't say, but I think two things jump out at us. Number one, it's the force of the zeal that Jesus is embodying here when the Spirit of God is flowing through him as it always does. But here his zeal is being poured forth and it's cowing them. They can't stand before this man. They're scared of what he represents. And I think perhaps the other part of the puzzle is that they know they shouldn't be here. You ever get caught doing something and just kind of slink away? Just like, I'll just step away. I think some of them were sheepishly, no pun intended with all the animals, just trying to get out of here. But I wonder, this is Monday. Did they set up shop here on Tuesday? Did they have the little, like at Apple Fest, did they have the little stalls, right, the little numbers so they knew where their spot was? Did those guys come back tomorrow and set up shop and do the exact same thing? I don't know. Maybe they, for this Passover, stopped and did the business somewhere else in the city. There's one more example of what's going on here, and this one is telling. And would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. Here we see how far laxity and convenience have marred temple worship, at least for the Gentiles that are trying to worship here. In addition to all of this business being done in the sacred space that's supposed to be holy, space that's supposed to be set apart for one use only, the worship of God. People were also walking through the court of the Gentiles because it's a shortcut. They wanted to save the effort of going around. After the destruction of the temple that will take place in 70 AD, was written something called the Berachot Mishnah. It is a rabbinical, rabbis wrote it, commentary on the scriptures. It was written after the temple was destroyed, and the only thing left is the Temple Mount. It is a flat, empty space when this is written. In that commentary, the rabbis write, do not cut through the temple court out of respect for the Holy of Holies which once stood there. Generation or two after this, when there is no temple, some of the rabbis at least were saying, respect the space. Which tells you that even then they were still cutting through. When Jesus does this, they're cutting through while the temple is standing there, while the Gentiles are trying to worship the Lord. And of course, there's this market going on. The sound and smell of animals shows us how little regard the people, including the chief priests, they're the ones that set this up, how little regard they have for the sacred quality of the house of God. They might think they respect the house of the Lord, but the way they're treating this area, they do not. But it especially tells me how little value they place on Gentile converts. Greeks, Egyptians, Babylonians who have come to know the Lord, and they don't care about them. The need that these Gentiles have to worship the Lord is being ignored entirely. Either one of those insults would be unacceptable when perpetrated by the people, let alone by those who are in charge of worship, those who are supposed to be leaders. Look at Jesus' rationale. And as he taught them, he said, "Is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations?" We read that from the prophet Isaiah this morning. What then is the sacred purpose of the temple space and its surrounding courts? As Isaiah says, it is a beacon to draw men and women from the ends of the earth to worship Yahweh, the God of Abraham, to bring people from all nations to worship here as a house of prayer. When Jesus was alive, it was the place where reconciliation with God for both Jew and Gentile was focused. The only place you could go for the sacrifices. It performed a valuable and non-transferable service for humanity. Were the sacrifices of the law of Moses necessary? Absolutely. Until Jesus himself is lifted up in a few short days, these sacrifices are holding at bay by the blood of bulls and goats the wrath of God from being poured out on not only his people but the world until the Messiah comes to finish it. But those sacrifices were not an end in themselves. They were a means to an end. The goal, the purpose of the sacrifices was relationship with God. The sacrifices allowed the people to fellowship with God without being destroyed for their unholiness, without the wrath of God busting out against them and leaving them dead. And that's what was being so crassly hindered in the court of Gentiles by a cacophony of commerce happening in a supposedly sacred space of prayer and worship. So let's take a step back from this text and look at our own world. As a parallel then, what is the purpose of a church building? Why do we make them? Why do we use them? What are they here for? Our individual church does not have the draw of Jerusalem's temple. You're aware of that, right? We don't have pilgrims coming from all over the world to come here. Some churches do, but we're not one of those. But the function is the same. The function of this church is the same as the function of the temple. It's just now diversified. Instead of one location acting as this massive lighthouse, like the lighthouse of Alexandria, to be seen from many distances, instead, God instituted many thousands of individual locations, many thousands of places where an individual candle is being held to light the way. Our town, Franklin, has about 20 of them. Together we seek to be houses of prayer for all peoples. So as we gather Sunday morning or anytime we worship, we're here to worship God, here in this space, as our brothers and sisters in Christ are doing in their own spaces. And we're doing so with the intent of shining the light of the truth of the love of God for all to see. We're praying that they may join us and be reconciled to God. Now, how we go about that differs slightly from what happens down at St. Pat's. A little bit different ritual, a little bit different music, and it differs from Christ United and St. John's and First United and everybody else. We're doing it a little bit differently. But our duty and our goal is the same, to worship and serve here in a way that highlights and does not hinder the gospel. But what did they do? You've made it a den of robbers. There Jesus quotes our other text from Jeremiah this morning. The temple that Jesus cleansed was failing in its mission. Who are they robbing? They are robbing both God and the people. They are robbing the people of a proper venue for the worship of God. And they're robbing God of the worship that those people want to give. From the point of view of God, the failure to provide and maintain a functioning sacred space, a failure of the priestly class in Jerusalem, including the high priest, the very people that are supposed to be working hardest to maintain a sacred space so people can easily connect with God. That failure was not just a sin of omission, it was a sin of commission. They were not simply failing to do what is right, but that failure was active participation in unrighteousness. It made them thieves. Is that warning sufficiently frightening to convince us as a church to not do likewise? We'd rather not be called thieves before God, right? How then could a church fall into the same trap and desecrate their sacred space? Before we consider that question, let's note this. That question has nothing to do with the quantity or quality of the space of any physical building. In the church age, with the Holy Spirit as our guarantee of redemption, each location where the people of God gathers to worship is a church. It can be a home, it can be a park outside, it can be a storefront that's been converted, it can be a school building, it can be a small country church, or the grandest cathedral in Europe. They're all sacred spaces when the people of God gather to worship there. And they're all spaces worthy of respecting their function. So then, this beautiful sanctuary that we have, passed down to us by our ancestors in the faith who worshiped here more than 100 years ago, it will not guarantee that what we do is pleasing to God, any more than Herod's magnificent temple prevented Jesus from being appalled by what he found there. A church will fail in its mission to provide a sacred space when all people cannot come to worship there. Let's look at reasons and ways in which churches might fail to fulfill their mission as a parallel. Number one, a church will fail in its mission to provide a sacred space when some people aren't welcome there. Much like the temple, a direct parallel. We all know that racism has and does hinder worship in some churches. In some churches, people not belonging to the majority race or ethnicity here in the United States and in other countries around the world. I've seen it, I saw it in Guatemala. In some churches, some people are either explicitly or implicitly unwelcome. Either it's made known, you are not welcome here, or there is such animosity in the building that people get the hint. The same holds true for people of other nationalities, people that speak other languages, people from a different class, and a number of other factors that would tragically deter people from coming to church, whether they're ex-cons or people that are divorced or those dealing with substance abuse or other addictions, people with questions of their sexuality, people that have, for one reason or another, been made to feel unwelcome. They're not going to visit. They're not going to join a congregation. But know this, we all came here to this sacred space 100% by grace. If our subsequent behavior as a church makes us gatekeepers, barring them, whoever we define them to be, from coming to God by grace just like we did, woe to us. Jesus has choice words for such people. This is something the church has failed to do in the past and continues to struggle with in many places. A second way in which a church might fail to provide sacred space is if it spends more time and more focus perpetuating itself, particularly by a focus on asking for money, than it does on fellowship and worship. When COVID hit, we stopped passing the offering plate when we came back after that. And you know what? I don't miss it a bit. I don't miss that part of our worship service. It's sitting back there. People can put in when the Lord leads them. I don't miss breaking up our worship for that at all, and I don't intend to bring it back. Now, we know it takes money to maintain a church. We've got a budget. We've got a quarterly business meeting after church to talk about that. But that concern must remain far from our focus. And it can never be seen by outsiders to be our goal. We're not here to simply perpetuate this church for another generation. God and God alone will make that possible. We are but stewards of His house. We are not the creators of the next generation. We are just simply stewards of what God is doing. But for many of the non-church, for people who don't have a church background, weren't raised in the church, there is a strong belief that the church just wants your money. And you know what? People claiming to be Christians, at least, and some that are to blame for that. Many of them on TV or other venues where it seems like this is all about perpetuating the ministry, selling the newest book, the newest seminar, asking for money. And I'm not just talking about the prosperity gospel where they're blatant about it. A church fails to provide sacred space when people get the impression that we're just about perpetuating the ministry. Thirdly, a church fails to provide sacred space if it cares more about power in this world than in serving God on behalf of the kingdom to come. The lure of politics and the pursuit of power is an ever-present siren's song. But like the ancient myth, if we listen to the siren, we will be dashed as a church upon the rocks. We have only one Savior, one Lord, and our citizenship is in heaven. You know I care about this issue. I write about it and talk about it a lot. This is not a red church, and this is not a blue church. People who voted for Donald Trump, people who voted for Joe Biden, people who voted for whoever else was on the ballot wherever, and people who said, you know what, I don't want to vote, are equally welcome here. And they'd better be. Or I may flip some tables. Probably not, because I'd have to pick them up afterwards, but you get the point. A fourth reason why a church might actually fail to provide sacred space is if the people of the church fail to love and bear fruit. A spiritually dead church is no more attractive to outsiders who need to hear the gospel than a carcass on the side of the road bloated and buzzed by flies. Was that vivid enough for you? If this is not a place of love, if the fruit of the Spirit and service to others is not happening here, then our worship is in vain. It's meaningless. if being with the people of God isn't transforming our lives, is not making us more Christ-like, then it's not doing one of the two things we're explicitly commanded by Jesus as a church to do: share the gospel and make disciples. Discipleship is the culmination, the conclusion of evangelism. If a church isn't doing that, then it's not providing sacred space. How does Jesus end this? The chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him, because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. So having called them out for their failure to provide a proper sacred space, having challenged their self-image in the process, how did the religious leaders of Jerusalem respond to this well-deserved and earned rebuke from Jesus? Well, look at the text. They put on sackcloth and ashes. They fasted and prayed, right? No. They did not follow in the footsteps of pagan Nineveh, who sought the mercy of God when Jonah said, 40 days and the city will be destroyed. No, not at all. Instead, they tried to figure out how to quietly kill Jesus. When your doctor says, do this or you'll be dead in 6 months, how many people listen and do what they're told? You want to know the number? It's lower than you think. I have a number of friends and acquaintances who are doctors, and that is one of their greatest frustrations. They say, you got to stop doing this, you got to start doing that, and then 2 years later that person is back with the same symptoms that have grown worse, and he says, did you do what I said? And he said, no. And he goes out into the hall and bangs his head on the wall for a while. You're not listening. Jesus showed them their error, and they decided, I'd rather kill the messenger. The average person on the street could see Jesus was on to something. The people were amazed. He was radiating truth and authenticity and devotion to the Father. A healthy church is like that too. You can feel it in the air. It's almost an electric feel. Genuine worship. Love freely given to anyone who walks in the door. Outsiders can tell when a church has it and when a church doesn't. It's absolutely true. So if, when God calls us up short, when God points out to us where we have failed in some area, what we need to do to be better, and God shows that to us, may we have the humility to bend our knee, set aside our pride, and actually obey. Applications from this text. Number one, it's our obligation as a church to provide and maintain a sacred space for worship, available for anyone whom God calls to come here. Absolutely. Secondly, there are ways, a number of ways, a church could lose sight of that mission. But one sure way to make sure they're on track: worship in spirit and truth, overflow with love. And then lastly, our prayer: may we always hear God's correction, heed it, and repent.